welcome to another edition of My Model Corner. In this installment, we'll be focusing on the A-18F, the two-seater version of the Super Hornet. We'll also try our hand at creating a flight deck mini diorama base. The decals provide the option of insignia for VFA 102 or VFA 103. I've always liked the skull and crossbones motif, so VFA 103 it'll be. I want to aim for a carrier base look for this F-18, so let's experiment with variations in our marbling and pre-shading techniques. The newer Super Hornet is larger, has more fuel capacity, and more advanced avionics than the earlier version of the Hornet. You can determine if you're looking at the old or new Hornet by noting the engine air intake contours. The old intakes are oval, while the Super Hornets are rectangular. Both the forward and aft cockpits have raised detail and console lines. Strangely, Hasegawa provides decals for the instrument panels, which would require the sanding down of the raised portions in the cockpits to apply these stickers. Definitely go with the molded detail. Time to break out the airbrush and start painting. We have different approaches to improve detail of the display units. We could apply bright green paint and then cover it with clear epoxy. Or we can glue in cut aluminum foil and paint over with the clear green. You can create custom decals, however the sizes of the screens are too small here to get detailed images, so I simply painted them in. We can still make use of the cockpit decals by trimming out the instrument dials and adding them in. Since the ejection seats are black, we need to bring back the detail lost by the paint layer. I scrape away at the edges of raised portions to highlight the shapes, which also renders the effect of wear and reflected light. Now we can color in the seat cushions. Next, we airbrush the panel faces. Lightly scraping away the black paint to expose the gray plastic with a knife, we can establish the finer details of the knobs, buttons, and switches. Importantly, we also paint the yellow and black striping of the seat ejection handles, which adds some color to the cockpits. At this point, the cockpits look too clean, so I gently rub in some panel wash. In step 3, we come to a big decision. The kit offers the option to display this F-18 with folded wings. I think this would make the model more eye-catching, so we'll go in this direction. I begin by darkening the cut lines with a pencil to make them more readily visible. Next, I lightly score these lines several times with a knife to slowly separate the wing into two pieces. Unfortunately, I discovered the lines in the exterior and the interior of the wing are not lined up. This is something you have to watch for if you build the folding wing option into your model. As a result, the exterior lines should be the ones you select as your guide. I repeat the same steps for the upper half of the wing in the same way. In this case, we need to cut the piece into 3 sections: the inner portion, the folding wing fairing, and finally the outermost portion of the wing. After the separation, be sure to clean up your edges. Now we made our wing halves starting with the inner left wing, and then the outer portion. Subsequently, we add the hinge to the inner wing section. This is the pivot point for the fold of the outer wing segment. The intake pieces each have 3 circular mold contact points. These probably won't be visible once the model is completed, but I file them away and use a sanding sponge to smooth out the surfaces. Similarly, I tried this using my knife at an oblique angle, which was easier than the file. Before we can continue construction, we have to paint the interior of the intakes. To save some time, I also hit the main gear bays, landing gear door interiors, the nose landing gear bay, and the landing gear struts. Like the Hasegawa F-22 Raptor that I built previously, the intake portion of the build is finicky and problematic. The pieces did not fit well in some places, and when making adjustments in positioning, it only caused problems in other places, so it takes some patience. It's time to mate up with the lower fuselage. This also proved to be a bit fussy. It took some finesse to get the parts in place, and it will still require some putty and sanding to make this flush in the area by the chaff flare canisters. As you can see, the unconventional engineering nature of these segments in the kit leaves long seam lines that will need work. The left side was not going well. There was a large gap. However, by removing the alignment tab, I was able to better fit this intake. The next step is to add the main portion of the wings. I add wash to the landing gear to create those shadow effects as well as bring out the finer detail of these parts. I follow on by attaching the nose and cockpit section to the lower fuselage. More panel wash is added, this time to the main gear bays, making sure we have the darkest lines at the joints. We can then clean up using our cotton swab to remove the wash from the highest points, establishing the illusion of reflected light and emphasizing lines and shadows in other areas, as well as grime and fluid leaks depending on the appearance you're aiming for. We proceed with the nose gear bay in a similar manner. And in a similar fashion, we hit the main gear. The Tamiya panel wash dries quickly, so it may take some effort to clean it up. Now that the nose section is cured to the lower fuselage, we attach the upper fuselage. While that bonds together, we can save some time by working other areas of the model. I do some preliminary painting of the upper tail flash for the vertical tails. We can also get a head start on the engine nozzles by painting them now. I use my standard oil paint to highlight the nozzle feathers as well as create the look of discolored metal surfaces from the heat exhaust. Cotton swabs are one of the best tools in model making for me, as well as my airbrush. I repeat the same steps for the inside of the nozzle. In this clip, I sand down the ridge between the upper and lower fuselage halves. Panel lines and other details are masked off to protect them from the sanding stick. We can follow up by applying water-soluble putty to fill in gaps and eventually even out the surface between the halves. After the putty is dried, we can clean up using a wet cotton swab and improve on the shaping of the filler on the exterior and within the gaps. Moving along, we then add the leading edge flaps to the main wings at a 2-degree down angle. Returning our attention to the folding wings, we attach the fairing, leading edge flap section, and a portion of the trailing edge aileron. Next, we attach the housing and flap actuators of the main wing segment. I use a combination of masking tape, cotton tufts, and bits of paper towel to cover and fill in areas to protect sections of the jet from overspray during the main airbrushing phase of our project. As usual, we black shade and provide a primer coat to our fighter jet. This will give us the opportunity to create tonal and shading differences in the appearance of the model. Nothing new here. For this F-18, there's a two-tone color scheme with a darker gray on the top fuselage and flight control surfaces. In most photos, this difference between the upper and lower gray colors is difficult to see sometimes. Starting with the top, we apply our paint using the marbling technique once again. Now that the marble foundation is established, we can begin filling in the areas. How far you go depends on your taste and the look you're aiming for. The less you fill in, the greater the wear and tear look you'll achieve. To add to the exterior look of a Navy jet undergoing some of the impacts of high humidity and sea salt during carrier duty, I allow more of the black shading to remain exposed than usual to simulate those effects. I find it quite satisfying to watch the changes in the exterior appearance as I slowly airbrush in the sections. I continue to review the overall tonal contrast and note the realism that begins to develop. The top is complete. Note how the marbled look gives the model a full-scale accurate appearance. In keeping with the standard paint scheme, we use a slightly lighter gray pigment on the bottom of the jet. For the tails, I don't use a full gloss black paint so that they both appear as if they lost some of their luster during many months at sea. I also use the semi-gloss black to paint in the high visibility patterns on the upper fuselage. As I progress in model builds, it always looks just okay in the beginning, but with each new step I look and think, wow, isn't this great? I remember to the days of my childhood model building, and I can't believe how far I've advanced from the past. And that's the point, to have fun, entertain oneself, and improve with each new build project. There are other particulars we'll want to capture. Here's a few. The first is red trim on the edges of the interior landing gear doors. After masking both the exterior and interior of the cockpit canopy, we apply the semi-gloss black to match the surroundings of the upper fuselage. Next, we paint the rings where the engine nozzles will be inserted. Then the nose gun port, also in titanium silver. I want to capture the boot prints and smudges left by the flight crews and maintenance personnel on the strakes. I use a combination of pencil graphite and Tamiya weathering powders. I also add hand smudges on access doors. Finally, we paint in the navigation strip lighting on the vertical tails, the empennage, and the nose section. There are many screen or mesh-like panels on the fuselage, as well as these on the folding wings. I fill in using the Tamiya soot powder once again and use an eraser to clean up. I'm really pleased with the overall paint job so far, but I'm concerned that the Tamiya panel wash or my usual concoction of an oil paint based wash will darken the skin more than desired. To counter this, I experiment using an old childhood technique I employed when I first started out model building, and I didn't have an airbrush or even knew about the concept of washes. In what I'll call pencil shading, I sharpen a standard pencil so that it has a knife edge point. I drag the pencil through the panel lines to darken and highlight them. I then use an eraser to adjust the contrast, tone, and width, as well as clean up anywhere the pencil may have slipped out of the scribed line, and also I can create more smudging and grime patterns where desired. I also do a bit of post shading along rivet lines using the Tamiya soot powder. Once all this is completed, we can seal in all this pencil and powder work with the final dull coat, semi-gloss, or gloss coat as required for your project. For the final weathering phase of the main fuselage, I add in fluid and lubricant streaks contaminated with dirt using black oil paint. We now turn our attention to the vertical tails. We have a dark paint, so regular dark wash will not work here effectively. We can choose anywhere from a less than stark black wash all the way down to pure white if needed. I mix black and white oil-based paints to get a medium gray wash to emphasize the tail detailing. With the installation of the flaps and engine nozzles, I'm as far as I want to go with the assembly before adding the decals. At this point, it will be easier to maneuver the model and separate flight control surfaces to add the emblems and labels. I utilize my usual decal solvents, Microset and Microsol. Here's a little bit of the labeling work. We start by getting our decal in place over a layer of Microset, then rolling the cotton swab over the transfer to remove excess liquid and any air. With each pass, I gradually increase pressure to set the decal in place. Then I coat with a brushed layer of Microsol. I repeat the process here for the all-important skull and crossbones logo. Now that the decals are complete, we can begin installing more items. We'll start with the bottom and attach the wing external fuel tanks and pylons. Then, the AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles and their associated rails and pylons. This is followed on by attaching the nose gear assembly. I find landing gear assemblies the most difficult aspect of constructing model aircraft. The parts tend to be small, delicate, and can easily snap apart. Additionally, the alignment of all the gear arms, struts, and doors usually require a fine juggling act. The instructions for this kit were not all that clear, but after dry fitting each piece, I found that Hasegawa's planning here was actually very good and everything fit easily and well together. Let's roll 180 degrees. Now to the key element of the folding wings. They should be set in slightly greater than 90 degrees inboard, so we angle them appropriately. Next we airbrush in a dull coat. This can achieve a few things for us. It evens out the overall tonal quality of the aircraft and removes hot spots of uneven reflectivity. It also seals in our decals, weathering to include the pencil shading, powders, and fluid leaks. Separately, we apply a semi-gloss coat to also even out the tint of the vertical tails. Before we do the final unveiling of our F-18, let's build our display base. Depending on your project, it can be a variety of sizes. For instance, we can use this aerial image of the USS Independence to plan our layout. Subject to the area of the deck you want to recreate, you can move any size box representing your display base dimensions around the image for planning flight deck markings, hatches, tie-down locations, jet blast deflectors, etc. As an option, you could build different sections of the carrier deck so that you can change up your model's display base from time to time or enlarge your overall presentation by adding sections together. I recommend using a robust piece of material such as wood rather than foam core or cardboard. I've chosen a piece of leftover plexiglass I had in my garage. It's about the right size I need considering the limited space I have to exhibit my F-18. The piece is already 8 inches wide and 1/4 inch thick. Earlier, I sized up the length needed for the base during the early stages of this model build. After cutting the piece down to 16 inches in length, I scuffed the surface using coarse sandpaper to aid in the adherence of the anti-slip texture. I clean up first with a rag moistened with water, then I wipe down the surface with alcohol using a microfiber cloth. The black anti-skid texture that is applied on Navy ship decks resembles a roughness as if it had been applied with a mop. Therefore, I'm using AK Interactive Concrete. There is an asphalt texture available by AK, but the lighter concrete color should aid in the overall look of the deck as we apply added layers of paint. I spread the concrete evenly over the plexiglass base. It can be difficult at first to get an even surface. However, by using a spray bottle to mist the texture with water, we can better control the application of the concrete. Once the plexiglass is covered and leveled out, let the plate dry. Next, we can apply some flight deck markings to make the base look more interesting. I mark out the areas to ensure that I have the correct orientation, as well as some interesting features that include the port edge as well as part of the center line of the runway. We'll want to add tie-down posts, also known as pad eyes. Looking at the tie-downs in this image, we can see that they run in a straight line or diagonal pattern depending on the angle you're viewing them. On some areas of the deck, the tie-downs have different spacing and layout patterns, but the majority is in this configuration. Using photos and doing some measurements, I came up with a simplified schematic for our 1/48 scale display base. The posts from center to center in the vertical line are approximately 6 feet apart, which is 1.5 inches at 1/48 scale. The offset distance between adjacent columns of the tie-downs are 3 feet. Finally, the distance between adjacent columns is 5 feet, equating to 1¼ inches in 48 scale. For additional accuracy in laying out the patterns, we can form a right triangle and use the Pythagorean theorem to calculate the diagonal distance between the two tie-downs of adjacent columns. Thus, we get 5.8 feet, which is 1.45 inches at 1/48 scale. Using this blueprint, I marked the positions for the tie-downs. Then I drilled depressions where they will be added to the deck. These dips mimic the space in a tie-down where the hook of a chain length slips in so that jets and equipment are secured to the deck. Next, I use a sanding block to clean up and even out the surface. I then mask off the deck to apply the white and yellow deck designs. For the next step, we mask off the flight deck striping to add our black shading. Much like road asphalt, the black coloring of a carrier deck eventually fades to different shades of gray, and the coloring is not uniform. Therefore, we can experiment using the marbling technique to replicate this look much like the way we painted our F-18. I airbrush on black coloring to simulate the qualities of the shading contrast of the deck surface. Let's take off the masking and see our results thus far. I went darker with the black than originally planned to produce a greater juxtaposition between the gray of the jet and the dark flight deck. I think this will nicely highlight each component. We can now add the photo etch tie downs to our carrier deck. Definitely use superglue to secure these to your display base. To dirty up the deck with tire marks and grime, I use Tamiya weathering powder. We can also mix in a bit of pencil graphite. To add an additional appeal factor to the display, I paint in alternating white and red striping along the edges that look similar to deck markings, as well as imitate in appearance that this piece was cut directly out of the main carrier deck. Okay, this portion is complete. Let's add the finished F-18F Super Hornet to our display and present our final showroom piece. Take care, and we'll see you later.
Heading 315 now, speed 430, Angels approximately 8,000. Station. Roger, Angels now 11. Steady up. 6 miles, 6 miles. Tally 2, tally 2. Hey, I'm high cover on you. Lock him up. Lock him up, sir. Good kill. Hey, good kill. Apologies, that's it. Get out of the second one. Okay, Meister, let's head north.